A millionaire married his nanny for his child's sake, but she made him believe in love again. Alexander Whitmore had built an empire on discipline, control, and unyielding focus. Every decision, every calculated move had led him to power and wealth beyond measure. But none of it could fill the void left behind by his wife's tragic passing. Love, in his eyes, was a fleeting illusion, one that left only pain and devastation in its wake. He had learned that lesson the hard way, and he had no intention of repeating it. His mansion stood as a testament to his beliefs. Grand, pristine, and meticulously structured, it reflected the very essence of its owner. No warmth, no laughter, only cold perfection. Employees moved through the halls with silent efficiency, fulfilling their duties without question. No one dared to break the unspoken rule. Emotions had no place here. Yet, within the walls of that lifeless home, a small soul suffered in silence. Lily, his 5-year-old daughter, had once been the light of his life. But after her mother's passing, that light had faded into shadows. She no longer spoke, no longer smiled. Her eyes, once full of mischief, now held only an emptiness too heavy for a child to bear. He had tried everything: doctors, therapists, the most highly recommended nannies. None had succeeded. They came and went, unable to break through the barrier Lily had built around herself. Some left in frustration, others in quiet defeat. And Alexander, though he would never admit it, felt a gnawing sense of failure. No amount of wealth or power could fix what was broken inside his daughter. Then came Evelyn Carter. She arrived at the Whitmore estate on a crisp autumn morning, stepping into the grand foyer with a presence entirely unlike those before her. There was no stiffness in her posture, no fear in her eyes as she met Alexander's calculating gaze. Her warmth radiated like a quiet fire, steady and unshaken by the coldness surrounding her. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Whitmore," she said with quiet confidence, her hands clasped before her. "But before we begin, I'd like to meet Lily." Alexander narrowed his eyes. Most candidates spoke first of their credentials, their experience. Evelyn's priority, however, was different. He couldn't decide if it was admirable or foolish. "She doesn't speak," he said, his voice crisp, as if the words alone could ward off disappointment. "She doesn't engage. You are here to follow a routine and ensure her basic needs are met. That is all." Evelyn didn't flinch at his harsh tone. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, observing him as if he were the puzzle to be solved. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore, she's a child, not a duty." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He had no patience for sentimentality. "You will follow the house rules, Miss Carter." "Of course." She nodded, but her unwavering gaze told him that she would not be easily intimidated. And so, the clash began. Evelyn was unlike the rigid professionals who had come before her. When they saw Lily as a job to be completed, she saw a child in need. She didn't push, didn't demand words from her. Instead, she simply existed in Lily's space, giving her the time and security to come to her in her own way. At first, Lily ignored her, as she had done with all the others. She barely acknowledged Evelyn's presence, retreating deeper into her shell. But Evelyn remained patient. She spoke to Lily as if she were listening, even when no response came. She read bedtime stories with gentle enthusiasm, even when Lily refused to look at the pages. She left small gestures of kindness, a favorite stuffed animal placed beside her, a soft blanket tucked around her sleeping form. She treated Lily not as a silent obligation, but as a child deserving of love and care. Alexander watched from the sidelines, his skepticism unwavering. "She's wasting her time," he muttered one evening, standing near the doorway as Evelyn read to Lily, the child staring blankly at the floor. "She's patient," his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Harris, remarked. "Something this house hasn't seen in a long time." Alexander said nothing, but the words lingered. Then, one evening, something changed. Evelyn had just finished another bedtime story when she rose to leave. As she reached the door, a small hand clutched the hem of her sleeve. It was brief, barely a second, But it was the first sign of trust Lily had shown in years. Evelyn froze, glancing down, her heart pounding. She didn't move too quickly, didn't startle the moment. Instead, she smiled softly and knelt down. "Do you want me to stay a little longer?" she asked gently. Lily didn't speak, but she didn't let go either. And so Evelyn stayed. Alexander stood in the hallway, unseen, watching the scene unfold. A lump formed in his throat, one he refused to acknowledge. It was relief, yes, but also something else, something far more dangerous. Hope. As the days passed, Lily's quiet trust in Evelyn grew. It was in the way her tiny fingers sought hers when crossing the hall, the way she would sit a little closer during story time. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Alexander should have been satisfied. He should have been grateful that someone had finally reached his daughter. But instead, he felt a gnawing unease. Evelyn was kind. Too kind. She was changing things, disrupting the carefully constructed world he had built. She was making Lily believe in warmth again, in care, in love. And that terrified him, because what if one day she left? What if she became just another person who walked away, leaving behind nothing but more pain? He reminded himself that attachments were dangerous, that emotions led to nothing but loss. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to resist it, he couldn't deny the truth forming in the back of his mind. Evelyn Carter was more than just a nanny. She was a force he wasn't prepared for. And for the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore found himself afraid, not of losing control, but of feeling something again. Evelyn stood by the large bedroom window, watching the early morning mist roll over the vast Whitmore estate. The towering mansion, once intimidating and foreign, had become something of a second home, yet she knew she couldn't stay. Her contract was nearing its end, and soon, another nanny would take her place. That was the way it had always been. Alexander Whitmore had made it clear from the start. Her presence in this house was temporary, a mere solution to a problem. And yet, deep in her heart, she knew it wasn't just the house she would be leaving behind. It was Lily. The little girl who had once hidden behind walls of silence now clung to her with a trust so fragile, so rare, that the thought of breaking it made Evelyn's chest ache. But she had no choice. Staying any longer would only make it harder. She had seen this before, how attachments formed, how people convinced themselves that they belonged where they didn't. She couldn't afford to be one of them. With a quiet sigh, she turned from the window and reached for the small suitcase on the bed. She had packed lightly, as she always did, knowing that leaving was inevitable. Still, her hands trembled as she folded the last of her belongings. Her heart waging a silent war with her mind. She had done her job. She had given Lily warmth, care, and patience. But now it was time to go. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his gaze impassive as ever. "You're leaving," he stated. Not a question, not a plea, just a fact. Evelyn met his gaze, searching for any trace of emotion, but found none. Of course not. This was Alexander Whitmore, a man who had long since buried his heart beneath layers of indifference. "My contract is almost up," she said simply, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "It's time." He nodded once, as if her departure was no more significant than the changing of seasons. "A new nanny will be here by the end of the week." The finality in his tone should have made things easier. Instead, it sent a sharp pang through her chest. She had expected this, his detachment, his unwillingness to acknowledge anything beyond the surface. And yet, it hurt more than it should. She forced herself to smile, though it felt hollow. "That's good. Lily needs consistency." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. After a long silence, he finally turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing there with an ache she couldn't explain. She shook her head, as if trying to rid herself of the foolish hope that he would say something more, that he would ask her to stay. But that was ridiculous. Alexander didn't beg. He didn't plead, and he certainly didn't care. That afternoon, Evelyn found Lily in the playroom, curled up in the corner with her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. She hesitated before kneeling beside her, brushing a gentle hand over the little girl's dark curls. "Lily," she whispered, her voice soft. "I need to talk to you." The child lifted her head slowly, her wide brown eyes filled with an unspoken sadness. Evelyn's throat tightened. "I have to leave soon," she continued, forcing the words out, even as her heart screamed against them. "But you're going to be okay. You're such a strong, brave girl." Lily stared at her for a long moment before, without warning, she shoved the stuffed rabbit into Evelyn's lap and scrambled to her feet. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse, trembling. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was the first word Lily had spoken in months. "Sweetheart, no." The child's voice broke as she launched herself into Evelyn's arms, gripping her so tightly that her tiny fingers trembled against Evelyn's back. "Don't go." The whispered plea shattered something inside Evelyn. Tears pricked her eyes as she held Lily close, feeling the little girl's body shake with silent sobs. Across the room, Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a long time, he said nothing, but Evelyn could see it, the flicker of something unfamiliar in his usually cold gaze. Something raw, something helpless, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked truly lost. That night, Alexander sat alone in his study, a drink untouched in his hand as he stared out at the endless stretch of darkness beyond the window. Lily's voice echoed in his mind, breaking through the fortress he had built around himself. "Don't go." He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling sharply. He had spent years keeping emotions at bay, convincing himself that love was nothing but a fleeting illusion, a weakness he couldn't afford. But now, he was faced with something he couldn't ignore, his daughter's pain, her desperate plea for the one person who had managed to reach her. And it left him utterly powerless. He had to fix this. He had to find a way to make Evelyn stay. But how? He couldn't beg. He didn't know how. And even if he did, what good would it do? Evelyn wasn't the type to be swayed by money or power. She was different. She cared, but she also had limits. He couldn't ask her to stay out of obligation. He knew that much. He needed a solution, a permanent one. The idea came to him suddenly, cold and precise, like every other business decision he had ever made. A contract, a deal, a marriage. Logical, practical, free of emotion. It was the only way. The next morning, Evelyn found herself summoned to Alexander's office, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She had barely slept, haunted by Lily's broken voice, by the way the child had clung to her, as if letting go would shatter her. When she entered the office, Alexander was already standing behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said. The air between them was heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite name. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair across from him, bracing herself for whatever was coming. He was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "Marry me." The words were so abrupt, so emotionless, that Evelyn could only blink at him in stunned disbelief. "What?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Lily needs stability. You're the only person she trusts. If you leave, she'll retreat back into silence." His voice remained cool, detached, as if he were discussing a mere transaction rather than something as life-altering as marriage. "This is the best solution." Evelyn felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. You think marriage is a solution?" He nodded, completely unfazed by her shock. "It's logical. You'll have financial security. Lily will have consistency. And he hesitated just for a fraction of a second before continuing. "I won't have to worry about another nanny coming and going." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. He wasn't asking her to stay because he wanted her. He was asking because she was convenient. A means to an end. Evelyn swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. "And what about love?" A shadow flickered across his face, but it was gone before she could read it. Love is irrelevant. Of course it was. She had known this from the beginning. Alexander Whitmore did not love. He did not feel. And yet, looking at him now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying to her, to himself. She should say no. She should get up and walk away. But then she thought of Lily, of the way the little girl had sobbed in her arms, of the way her voice had cracked with fear and longing. And suddenly, the decision didn't feel like hers to make. Evelyn sat by the window of her small quarters, staring at the suitcase she had yet to pack. Her contract would be over in a few days, and she had already made up her mind. She would leave the Whitmore estate. It was the only choice that made sense. Staying any longer would only make it harder. She had grown too attached to Lily, and the little girl had unknowingly carved a place in her heart that Evelyn was terrified to acknowledge. But she had always known this was temporary. She was just a nanny, easily replaceable, and she refused to let herself believe otherwise. With a heavy heart, she began folding her clothes, each movement slow and deliberate, as if dragging out the process would somehow make this easier. A soft knock at the door startled her, and she turned to find one of the house staff peeking inside. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you in his office." The words sent a cold ripple down her spine, but she nodded without. She found Alexander sitting behind his grand mahogany desk, as indifferent as ever. His gaze barely lifted from the papers in front of him as she stepped inside. "I assume everything is settled for your departure?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. Evelyn's heart clenched at his detachment. She had spent months in this house, caring for his daughter, and yet, to him, she was nothing more than an employee fulfilling a contract. She straightened her back, determined not to let her emotions betray her. "Yes, I'll be leaving at the end of the week." There was a brief silence before he finally looked at her, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. "Good." The word stung more than it should have, but she forced a nod and turned to leave, refusing to let him see the flicker of pain in her expression. The moment she stepped out of his office, a small figure came barreling into her. Lily's tiny arms wrapped around Evelyn's waist, her grip tight, desperate. "You're leaving?" The tremble in her voice shattered Evelyn's heart. She crouched down, cupping Lily's face gently. "Sweetheart, I—" Before she could finish, Lily let out a strangled sob, her entire body shaking. And then, for the first time in years, the little girl spoke. "Please don't go." The words were barely above a whisper, but they echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. The staff nearby froze, their eyes wide in shock. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Lily had not spoken a single word since her mother's death. She had been locked in silence, lost in a world of pain no one could reach. Yet here she was, her voice raw and desperate, pleading for Evelyn to stay. The sound of hurried footsteps signaled Alexander's arrival. He stopped at the sight before him, his normally composed face struck with something close to disbelief. His daughter, his silent, withdrawn daughter, was speaking, but it wasn't to him. It was to Evelyn. His chest tightened, an unfamiliar weight pressing down on him. He had believed Evelyn's departure wouldn't matter, that Lily would adjust, as she always did. But seeing her now, clinging to Evelyn like her life depended on it, shattered that illusion. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something dangerously close to helplessness. Lily sobbed harder, and Evelyn did the only thing she could. She held the little girl close, whispering soothing words. But nothing seemed to calm her. Alexander clenched his fists. He had built his life on control, on logic, on keeping emotions at bay. Yet at this moment, none of that mattered. He could not bear to see his daughter break like this. And so, against every instinct, he made a decision. One that was cold, practical, and devoid of emotion. At least, that's what he told himself. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm but firm. She looked up, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Stay." The word was not a request. It was an order. Evelyn swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I can't. My contract is over, and marry me." The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Evelyn's entire body went rigid, her breath stolen. She stared at him, certain she had misheard. But Alexander's face remained unreadable, his gaze locked on her. "Marry me," he repeated, his voice unwavering. Not for love, not for romance, but for Lily. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of shock and disbelief surging through her. "You can't be serious." Alexander straightened, his expression as cold as ever. "Lily needs stability." You leaving would destroy her. He spoke as if this were a business deal, as if he were offering her a contract instead of a proposal. In return, you'll have security for life. No financial struggles, no uncertainty. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps. This was madness. Marriage without love, without even the pretense of affection. She had seen what hollow marriages could do to people. And yet, she looked down at Lily, who clung to her with tear-streaked cheeks, her small hands trembling. This little girl, who had finally spoken, was begging her to stay. How could she walk away from that? But at what cost? She met Alexander's gaze again, searching for any sign of warmth, of sincerity. There was none. He wasn't doing this for her. He wasn't even doing it for himself. This was for Lily. Nothing more. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling sharply. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "I'll do it." The wedding was a cold, emotionless affair. There were no flowers, no vows of love, no tender moments. Only a legal agreement sealed with signatures and exchanged rings that felt more like shackles than symbols of unity. Evelyn stood beside Alexander in a simple white dress, her fingers numb as they slid the band onto his hand. His expression remained impassive, detached, as if he were merely fulfilling another obligation. As the officiant declared them husband and wife, Evelyn felt a weight settle in her chest. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't love. This was duty. The ride back to the estate was silent. Alexander sat beside her in the car, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed outside the window. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping her hands tightly in her lap. She had made her choice. For Lily. But as the car pulled up to the grand estate that was now her home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just locked herself into a life of loneliness. Days passed, and the reality of her new life set in. She was now Evelyn Whitmore, wife to a man who did not love her. She continued to care for Lily as she always had, but her role in the household had shifted. The staff treated her differently, their whispers following her wherever she went. Alexander remained distant, as if their marriage was nothing more than an inconvenience. Their conversations were brief, strictly about Lily, and any attempt to break through his walls was met with indifference. But despite his coldness, something was changing. She saw it in the way he lingered a little longer in the room when she read Lily bedtime stories, in the way his gaze softened, just for a second, when she laughed, in the way his jaw tensed when he saw her retreat to her own separate bedroom each night. He told himself this was nothing, that she was merely another presence in his house. But each time he watched her with Lily, each time he caught himself thinking about her, it became harder to deny. His heart, the one he had sworn would never thaw, was beginning to betray him, and it terrified him more than anything ever had. The first days of marriage were no different from the days before it. The grand estate remained as quiet and lifeless as ever, the walls echoing with an emptiness that Evelyn couldn't seem to fill. She had expected no warmth from Alexander, but the weight of his cold indifference settled heavily on her chest. He treated their marriage as nothing more than a business contract, and in many ways, that's all it was. Conversations were kept to the barest of exchanges, usually revolving around Lily's schedule or household matters. Dinners were silent affairs, the clinking of silverware against fine china the only sound between them. Alexander sat at the head of the table, always distant, always composed, as if she were merely an unwelcome guest intruding on his space. He made no effort to ease the awkwardness between them, and Evelyn, though frustrated, refused to let it affect her resolve. If he had no interest in being a husband, then she would pour all her attention into being the best mother figure she could for Lily. Yet, even that proved difficult. Alexander's presence, or lack thereof, hung over the household like an invisible force. He buried himself in work, using his late nights at the office as an escape. When he was home, he was a ghost, moving through the house without truly being present. Evelyn wondered if she had made a mistake, if she had doomed herself to a life of loneliness by agreeing to this loveless marriage. But then she thought of Lily, the way her little arms wrapped around her waist, the way her innocent heart still longed for a family. That was what mattered most. That was what kept her from walking away. One evening, Evelyn found herself wandering through the dimly lit hallways, unable to sleep. The house felt too vast, too empty, and for the first time in a long while, she missed the humble little apartment she had once shared with her mother. As she passed by Alexander's study, she noticed the soft glow of light spilling out from beneath the door. Without thinking, she gently pushed it open, expecting to find him immersed in work. Instead, she found him seated behind his desk, his usually unreadable expression replaced by something she had never seen before: raw, unguarded sorrow. His fingers traced the edges of an old photograph, and even from a distance, Evelyn could make out the image of a beautiful woman with kind eyes. His late wife, the love of his life. She hadn't meant to intrude, but the sight of him, so lost, so utterly consumed by grief, froze her in place. In that moment, she saw beyond the hardened exterior, beyond the coldness he wielded like a weapon. She saw a man who had loved deeply and lost even more. A man who carried the weight of that pain in every breath he took. He didn't notice her at first, his gaze fixed on the picture as if looking away would make her disappear forever. When he finally lifted his eyes, they were guarded once more, the vulnerability wiped away in an instant. "You should be asleep," he said, his voice clipped, controlled. Evelyn wanted to say something, to acknowledge the grief she had just witnessed, but she knew he wouldn't welcome her sympathy. So she simply nodded and stepped back, closing the door behind her. But the image of him sitting there, drowning in memories, lingered in her mind long after she had returned to bed. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to notice things she hadn't before. She saw the way Alexander watched Lily from a distance, as if torn between wanting to reach for her and holding himself back. He was never cruel to his daughter, never unkind, but he kept an emotional distance that Evelyn couldn't ignore. She saw the way his gaze softened when Lily giggled, the way his hands clenched at his sides when she ran into Evelyn's arms instead of his. It wasn't that he didn't love his daughter. He did, deeply, but something held him back, something that prevented him from stepping fully into the role of a father. Evelyn made a decision then. If Alexander wouldn't fight for himself, she would fight for him. She would fight for Lily. She would fight for the family they all deserved. Little by little, she started chipping away at the walls he had built. She refused to let the house remain a cold and lifeless place. She brought warmth into every room, whether it was through small conversations, playful laughter with Lily, or simply refusing to let Alexander retreat into himself entirely. At first, he resisted. He kept his distance, watching her warily as if unsure of her intentions. But she was nothing if not persistent. She found ways to draw him in, whether it was coaxing him to join them for dinner instead of eating alone in his study, or casually leaving books on his desk that she thought he might enjoy. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but they were there. The house no longer felt quite so suffocating. Laughter began to echo through the halls. Warmth seeped into the walls, and for the first time, it felt like a home rather than a prison. And then there were the moments, small, fleeting moments that should have meant nothing, but somehow meant everything. The way their hands brushed when they reached for the same dish at dinner. The way he caught her when she stumbled, his touch lingering just a second longer than necessary. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes filled with something unreadable. Alexander told himself it was nothing. That Evelyn was simply doing what she had promised, bringing stability to Lily's life. But his heart told him otherwise. He noticed things about her he hadn't before. The way she carried herself with quiet strength, the way she never backed down, the way her presence had begun to make his house feel like something he hadn't felt in years. A home. And that terrified him. Just when he started to lower his defenses, fear crept in again. He had let love in once before, and it had nearly destroyed him. He couldn't go through that again. He wouldn't. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He distanced himself. He became cold again, pulling back just when things were starting to change. Evelyn felt the shift almost immediately. He started avoiding her, retreating back into his work, shutting her out just when she had started to believe they were making progress. But this time she understood. It wasn't that he was incapable of love. It was that he was afraid of it. And that realization was more painful than any rejection. Because no matter how much she fought for him, no matter how much she tried to show him that love didn't have to end in loss, he had to be willing to fight for it too. And if he wasn't, then maybe she was fighting a battle she could never win. The silence in the mansion had never felt so suffocating. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the neatly packed suitcase by the door. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for it, but the ache in her chest refused to subside. Her time at the Whitmore estate had been temporary from the beginning. The contract was clear, 6 months. No attachments, no expectations. And yet, here she was torn apart by the thought of walking away. Lily had changed everything. The little girl who had once lived in silence, locked away in grief, had finally started to open up. Evelyn had watched her laugh, had held her through her nightmares, had spent nights by her bedside reading her stories until she drifted to sleep. But she couldn't stay, not when her presence was only delaying the inevitable. If she allowed herself to become more attached, the heartbreak would be unbearable. A sharp knock at the door broke her thoughts. Evelyn exhaled and stood, smoothing her hands over her dress before opening it. Alexander stood there, as composed as ever, his gaze unreadable. "Your car will be ready in the morning," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I assume everything is in order." She nodded, though the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. "Yes, I'll be gone before breakfast." He gave a curt nod, as if her departure was nothing more than a change in staffing. No sentiment, no hesitation. Just cold, practical efficiency. Lily will adjust. She always does. Evelyn flinched at his words. Did he really believe that? Did he not see how much his daughter had changed, how much she needed something constant in her life? But arguing would be pointless. Alexander Whitmore had made up his mind, and she was foolish to think he would be any different. That night, sleep refused to come. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the clock. Every second felt heavier than the last, dragging her toward a future she wasn't ready for. And then, just as she was about to force herself to get up, the sound of soft footsteps echoed outside her door. The door creaked open, and in the dim glow of the hallway light, she saw her. Lily. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her small frame trembling. Evelyn. Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile and uncertain. Evelyn's breath caught. It was the first time since she had arrived, that Lily had spoken. Tears welled in her eyes as she sat up, opening her arms. Without hesitation, Lily ran to her, burying her face in Evelyn's lap, her tiny hands gripping at her dress as if holding on for dear life. "Don't go," she pleaded. "Please don't leave me." Evelyn's heart shattered. She wrapped her arms around Lily, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Oh, sweetheart." Before she could say another word, she felt a presence at the doorway. Alexander. He stood frozen, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him. He looked shaken, as if the world beneath him had shifted. His daughter had spoken, had broken her silence for the first time, and it wasn't for him. It was for Evelyn. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Alexander stepped forward, his voice softer than Evelyn had ever heard it. "Lily, go back to bed." But the little girl only clung tighter to Evelyn, refusing to let go. "I don't want her to go, Daddy." A flicker of pain crossed his face, so brief Evelyn almost missed it. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before looking at Evelyn. "Stay." It wasn't a plea, not quite, but there was something desperate beneath the surface. A man who never begged was now teetering on the edge of something unfamiliar. Helplessness. Evelyn swallowed hard, fighting the wave of emotions threatening to consume her. "Alexander, I can't stay forever." His jaw tightened, as if fighting an internal battle. And then, just like that, his mask slipped back into place. "Then stay as my wife." Silence. Evelyn blinked, convinced she had misheard him. "What? Marriage?" His tone was clinical, detached. "Not for love. For Lily. She needs stability, and you provide that. I can give you financial security, ensure you never have to worry about anything again. In return, you stay. You remain in Lily's life. Evelyn couldn't breathe. She searched his face for any sign of emotion, of warmth, but there was nothing. This wasn't a man in love. This was a man solving a problem, making a deal. And yet, the weight of Lily's tiny arms around her waist was a cruel reminder of what was at stake. "You're offering me a business arrangement?" she whispered. "Call it what you want. But you and I both know Lily needs you." Evelyn looked down at the little girl who had burrowed in her side, already drifting into a restless sleep. Leaving would break her heart, but staying meant binding herself to a man who refused to feel, to a life where love had no place. She closed her eyes. There was no easy answer. But for Lily, she would endure anything. "Fine," she murmured. "I'll marry you." The wedding was as cold as the proposal. A courthouse, a few signatures, a lifeless exchange of rings. No vows, no whispered promises, no love. Just duty. Evelyn stood beside Alexander, her fingers clenched together as the judge declared them husband and wife. Alexander didn't even glance at her, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. It was a farce, a transaction, and yet as the reality of her new life settled in, she felt a hollow ache inside her chest. Afterward, they returned to the mansion. No celebrations, no embraces, just silence. Lily, blissfully unaware of the coldness between them, beamed up at Evelyn, her small fingers wrapped around hers. "You're staying?" Evelyn forced a smile, nodding. "I'm staying." Alexander watched the exchange from a distance, his face unreadable. And for the first time, Evelyn wondered if beneath all his coldness, his control, there was something else. Something even he was afraid to confront. The days that followed were an adjustment. They were husband and wife in name only. Evelyn continued to care for Lily, filling the mansion with warmth that had long been missing. But with Alexa, the evening air hung heavy inside the grand Whitmore mansion, silence stretching between its vast walls. Alexander hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the soft murmur of Evelyn's voice from the adjacent room caught his attention. He took an unconscious step closer, his hand gripping the doorframe as her words reached him. "I don't know how much more I can take," she whispered into the phone, her voice thick with emotion. "I've tried. I really have. But he doesn't love me, and I don't think he ever will." A sharp ache twisted in Alexander's chest. He wasn't sure what startled him more, the pain in her voice or the realization that he had caused it. She continued, unaware of his presence. "I wanted to believe things would change. That maybe, over time, he'd see me, really see me. But I feel like a ghost in my own home. I don't know if I can keep pretending I'm fine when I feel that." Alexander felt the breath leave his lungs. He had spent years perfecting the art of emotional detachment, convincing himself that it was safer to keep people at arm's length. And yet, here Evelyn was breaking under the weight of his coldness, her words exposing a wound he never meant to inflict. Without thinking, he took a step back, retreating before she could notice him standing there. Instead of facing the truth of what he had heard, he did what he did best. He buried himself in work, in silence, in avoidance. The days that followed were the coldest yet. Alexander threw himself into his business affairs with ruthless efficiency, leaving the house early and returning late. He no longer lingered in the hallways or the dining room where he might cross paths with Evelyn. Even when he saw Lily, he kept the encounters brief, using work as an excuse to disengage. It was easier this way, or at least, that was what he told himself. Evelyn, however, felt the weight of his absence like a physical wound. His avoidance was a confirmation of what she already knew. There was no hope, no future, no love. She had endured so much, waiting, hoping, convincing herself that patience would eventually thaw the ice around his heart. But now it was painfully clear. Alexander Whitmore was never going to love her, and she could no longer bear to stay in a house where she felt so unwanted. The decision came quietly, yet with a finality that left her breathless. She moved through the mansion, her hands trembling as she packed her few belongings. The space that had once felt like a home, however cold, now felt suffocating. She had built a life here, cared for Lily as if she were her own, tried to be a wife to a man who refused to let her in. But she would not lose herself in the process. Not anymore. The night before she planned to leave, Evelyn stood in the nursery, watching Lily sleep. The little girl's peaceful face was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Evelyn's heart. How could she say goodbye? How could she walk away from the child who had come to mean everything to her? But staying meant breaking apart piece by piece, and she had already lost too much of herself. Morning arrived faster than she wanted. With her bags packed, Evelyn made her way downstairs, her heart pounding with each step. She hadn't expected anyone to be awake, but the moment she stepped into the hallway, a small voice shattered the silence. "Don't go." Evelyn froze. The words were so soft, so fragile, that for a moment, she thought she had imagined them. But when she turned, she found Lily standing at the top of the stairs, tears streaming down her tiny face. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Lily!" The child ran toward her, wrapping her small arms around Evelyn's waist, clinging to her with all the desperation of someone who had already lost too much. And then, in a voice hoarse from disuse, she spoke again. "Please don't leave me." Evelyn felt her heart shatter. Lily's small body shook against her, years of silence breaking apart in an instant. This was what she had feared most, leaving Lily behind, knowing she would be another person who walked away. Tears burned in her eyes as she knelt, holding the child close, whispering reassurances she didn't even believe herself. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Something inside him cracked as he saw his daughter clinging to Evelyn, her voice breaking the silence she had upheld for years. This wasn't just about Lily. This was about all of them. Evelyn wasn't just a nanny or a wife of convenience. She was the very thing that had breathed life back into their home, and he had pushed her away. For the first time, fear gripped him, not the fear of loss, but the fear of a future without her. He had spent so long convincing himself that emotions were a weakness, that love was a risk not worth taking. But now, faced with the possibility of losing Evelyn forever, he realized the greatest mistake he had made wasn't letting her go. It was never holding on to her in the first place. As Evelyn pulled away, preparing herself for the inevitable goodbye, Alexander finally stepped forward, his voice raw and unsteady. "Evelyn, don't go." But she had already learned to guard her heart. And this time, she wasn't sure she could believe him. Alexander stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, the weight of Evelyn's words crashing down on him like an unbearable storm. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the sound of her voice, raw, vulnerable, and filled with quiet sorrow, had pulled him in, rendering him incapable of walking away. Her confession cut through him like a blade. She had never asked for his love, never demanded more than he was willing to give. Yet here she was, speaking of a pain he had forced her to bear. He clenched his fists, his mind at war with itself. He had told himself for years that love was a weakness, an illusion that only led to suffering. But why, then, did the thought of losing her feel like his world was crumbling? Unable to process it, he did what he always did. He withdrew. The days that followed were the coldest yet. Alexander became a ghost in his own home, barely acknowledging Evelyn's presence, burying himself in work and avoiding even the smallest of interactions. If she reached out, he offered clipped responses, never meeting her gaze for too long. He told himself it was for the best, that distance was necessary, but deep down, something inside him twisted painfully every time he saw the sadness in her eyes. She no longer tried to push past his walls. She simply accepted them. That was what terrified him the most. Evelyn had always been strong. No matter how cold or detached he had been, she had remained patient, warm, hopeful. But now that hope was gone. It was in the way she carried herself, in the way she no longer lingered near him, in the way she spoke to him only when necessary. He had shut her out for too long, and now she was finally shutting him out too. And for the first time in years, he felt fear. Then came the moment he had dreaded. Evelyn stood in their bedroom, a suitcase open on the bed, methodically folding her clothes. Alexander stood at the doorway, unable to move, his chest tight with something he refused to name. She didn't look up when she spoke. "I'll be leaving in the morning," she said softly. "I'll make sure Lily is comfortable before I go." Her voice was steady, but he knew better. He could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. His throat went dry. He wanted to say something, to stop her, to ask her to stay. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, silent, watching as she packed away the life they had built together. That night, sleep was impossible. The mansion, once a place of suffocating routine, now felt unbearably empty. He sat in his study, staring at the flickering flames of the fireplace, feeling a hollowness he had never known. He had lost before. He knew what grief felt like. But this was different. This wasn't just loss. This was destruction. He had built walls so high that he had locked himself in, and now Evelyn was walking away. And this time, he had no one to blame but himself. The morning came too quickly. Evelyn stood at the door, her bags beside her, her expression unreadable. She turned to Lily, kneeling down to meet the little girl's wide, confused eyes. "I love you, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a soft curl away from Lily's face. "But I have to go." Lily's bottom lip trembled. And then, the moment no one expected happened. "Don't go," she pleaded, her voice small, fragile. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. The words were barely above a whisper, but they were there. His daughter, who had remained silent for years, was speaking, and she was begging Evelyn to stay. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her hands shaking as she cupped Lily's face. "Sweetheart," her voice broke, torn between the love she had for this child and the pain of knowing she had to walk away. But Lily wasn't letting go. She clung to Evelyn, her tiny fingers gripping her dress, her sobs breaking the heavy silence. "Please stay," she cried. Alexander felt his entire world tilt. He had spent so long convincing himself that love was unnecessary, that it was safer to remain distant. But in that moment, seeing Lily's desperate, tear-streaked face, seeing Evelyn's heart breaking in front of him, something inside him shattered. He couldn't do this. He couldn't let her go. For the first time in years, he didn't think, he acted. "Evelyn, wait." His voice was hoarse, uneven, but it was enough to make her pause. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and unshed tears. He swallowed hard, every muscle in his body tense. "Don't go." Her expression wavered, her lips parting slightly, but she shook her head. "Alexander, you don't mean that." "Yes, I do." He stepped closer, his hands trembling at his sides. He had never begged, not once in his life. But now, standing here, watching the woman who had changed everything prepare to walk away, he knew he would do whatever it took to make her stay. "I can't lose you." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips. "You don't have me," she whispered. "You never did." The truth of her words hit him like a blow to the chest. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it. The fear, the regret, the unbearable weight of what he had done. "I know," he admitted, his voice raw, "but I want to fix this." Evelyn's gaze searched his, uncertainty warring with the pain in her eyes. She had given him so many chances, and each time, he had pushed her away. Why should she believe him now? Lily clung to Evelyn's side, her wide eyes flickering between them. Alexander looked down at his daughter, then back at the woman who had brought light into their lives. "Please," he whispered, barely able to get the word out. "Give me one more chance." Evelyn's breath hitched, her resolve crumbling. For so long, she had wanted to hear those words. But was it enough? Was he truly ready to change, or was this just desperation? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. And then, slowly, Evelyn closed her eyes, exhaling a trembling breath. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted softly. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then let me prove it to you." Evelyn hesitated, her heart warring with her mind. She had been ready to leave. She had steeled herself for this goodbye. But now, faced with the man she had loved in silence for so long, pleading, breaking, finally showing her something real, she wasn't sure she could walk away. Alexander took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay, Evelyn." And for the first time in years, hope flickered in his chest, fragile yet powerful, as he waited for her answer. Evelyn stood frozen, Lily's small arms wrapped tightly around her waist. The child's sobs racked her tiny frame, and her desperate grip only tightened as if she feared Evelyn would disappear the moment she let go. Alexander watched from a few steps away, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen his daughter like this, so vulnerable, so desperate. And for the first time, he truly saw what Evelyn meant to Lily. She wasn't just her nanny. She wasn't just his wife in name. She was the heart of their home, the one who had somehow mended what was once broken. "Please don't go," Lily whispered again, her voice hoarse from crying. The words cut through Evelyn like a blade, shattering the last bit of resolve she had tried so hard to hold on to. How could she leave when the little girl she loved as her own was begging her to stay? But how could she stay when the man she had given her heart to refused to love her back? Evelyn blinked away her own tears and gently crouched down so she was at Lily's level, cupping the little girl's face in her hands. "Sweetheart, I love you so much," she said softly, her voice trembling. But before she could finish, Alexander stepped forward, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. "Evelyn." His voice was raw, his usual composed demeanor completely stripped away. He wasn't sure what he was about to say, only that he had to stop her before it was too late. But Evelyn didn't look at him. Instead, she gently pried Lily's arms from around her waist and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You are so strong, my love," she murmured. "So brave." Lily shook her head violently, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't leave," she insisted, her voice laced with panic. "Daddy, tell her she can't go." Alexander felt the weight of his daughter's words settle deep within him, suffocating and relentless. He had spent years convincing himself that emotions were dangerous, that love only led to pain. But what was he doing now, if not causing the very pain he had tried so hard to avoid? He had hurt Evelyn. He had made her feel like she wasn't wanted. And now he was losing her. For the first time in his life, Alexander Whitmore was afraid. Evelyn stood, forcing herself to turn away from Lily before her own heartbreak swallowed her whole. She had to leave before she lost herself completely. But just as she took a step toward the door, a strong hand wrapped around her wrist, pulling her back. She gasped, turning sharply, and found herself staring into Alexander's dark, stormy eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with emotions neither had ever dared to express before. "Don't go," Alexander finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a plea, raw and unguarded. Evelyn had never heard him sound so vulnerable before. But she couldn't allow herself to be swayed by mere words, not when she had spent so long waiting for something, anything, from him that never came. She pulled her wrist from his grasp, shaking her head. "I can't do this anymore, Alexander." Her voice broke, the weight of her pain finally spilling over. "I have given you everything, my time, my heart, my love. And in return, you have given me nothing but coldness and distance. I can't keep living like this. I won't." Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him. He had always believed that if he didn't let himself feel, he couldn't get hurt. But standing here now, watching Evelyn slip away, he realized how wrong he had been. He had hurt her, and in doing so, he had destroyed the one thing he never thought he needed, her love. Desperation clawed at his chest, drowning him. "Evelyn," he said again, stepping closer. She took a step back. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't ask me to stay if you don't mean it." For a moment, he was silent, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. But then he took a deep breath, forcing himself to say the words he had been too afraid to admit for so long. "I do mean it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want you to go." He swallowed hard. The words sat heavy on his tongue, unfamiliar and terrifying. But when he saw the pain in Evelyn's eyes, he knew he had to say them before it was too late. "I love you." The room fell into a deafening silence. Even Lily, who had been sobbing uncontrollably moments ago, now stood still, watching them with wide, tear-streaked eyes. Evelyn's breath hitched, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. "What?" she whispered, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Alexander took another step toward her, his hands trembling at his sides. He had never said those words to anyone since his wife died. He had convinced himself he never would again. But now, standing here, looking at the woman who had changed everything, he knew he couldn't hold back any longer. "I love you," he repeated, his voice stronger this time. "I have loved you for longer than I even realized. I was a fool, Evelyn. I pushed you away because I was afraid. Afraid of what loving you would mean. Afraid of losing you, just like I lost her." His voice broke, and he ran a hand down his face. "But I see it now. I see what I almost lost. And I can't lose you. Not now. Not ever." Evelyn's throat tightened, tears brimming in her eyes. She had dreamed of hearing those words, longed for them. But could she trust them? Could she trust him? "I don't know if I can believe you," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "You spent so long pushing me away. How do I know this isn't just another way to keep me here?" Pain flashed across Alexander's face. "Because I can't lose you," he said simply. "Because I love you, and I will spend every single day proving that to you if you let me." Evelyn searched his face, her heart warring with her mind. And then, before she could stop herself, she whispered, "Say it again." Alexander didn't hesitate. "I love you." Her breath hitched. "I love you," he said again, stepping closer, cupping her face in his hands. "I love you, Evelyn." And just like that, the wall she had built around her heart crumbled. With a broken sob, she fell into his arms, clutching him as if she never wanted to let go. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. Lily, still sniffling, tugged at Evelyn's dress. "Does this mean you're staying?" she asked hopefully. Evelyn pulled back just enough to look down at the little girl she adored. She glanced up at Alexander, searching his eyes one last time. And for the first time, she saw nothing but love. With a soft smile, she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm staying." Evelyn clutched the handle of her suitcase, her heart pounding against her ribs as she took one last look around the mansion that had, against all odds, become her home. It should have been easy to walk away. She had convinced herself that she had no reason to stay, that Alexander's heart would never belong to her, that she was nothing more than an arrangement, a convenience for a man who knew nothing of love. Yet, as she turned toward the door, her steps faltered when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind her. Before she could react, a firm grip caught her wrist, pulling her back just enough to stop her in place. "You can't go." Alexander's voice was rough, almost breathless, as though the very act of stopping her had taken all his strength. She turned slowly, her chest tightening as she met his gaze. His usual mask of control was gone, replaced by something raw, something she had never seen in him before: desperation. "Let me go, Alexander," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her words. She had waited for this moment, for him to care enough to stop her. But was it too late? He shook his head, his grip loosening but not releasing her entirely. "No, not this time. I've let you walk away in my mind 100 times, convincing myself it wouldn't matter. But it does. It always did." His voice wavered, and for the first time since she had known him, Alexander Whitmore looked afraid. "I can't lose you, Evelyn." Evelyn inhaled sharply, her emotions warring against each other. She had spent months yearning for his love, hoping that one day he would see her as more than just Lily's nanny or his convenient wife. But now, with her heart battered and bruised, could she trust him again? "You don't love me, Alexander. You just don't want to be alone. That's not enough. I deserve more." Alexander swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "I know, and I swear to you, I will prove that you are more to me than I ever let myself admit." He took a step closer, reaching up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I was a coward, Evelyn. I let my past define me. I thought love was a weakness, that it would only bring pain. But you showed me that love isn't suffering. It's strength, and I am done being afraid." Tears blurred Evelyn's vision as she searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any remnants of the cold, detached man he had once been. But all she found was sincerity, a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. Actions speak louder than words, Alexander, she murmured, her voice unsteady. You can't just say these things and expect me to believe them. His lips pressed together in determination. Then let me prove it to you. Let me love you the way you deserve. Not because of Lily, not because of duty, but because you're the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too blind to see it. A shudder ran through her as she felt the walls around her heart begin to tremble. She had dreamed of hearing these words, but now that they were here, she didn't know how to trust them. I don't know if I can do this again, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. What if you push me away again? What if you decide I'm not worth the fight? Alexander exhaled, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin. Then I will spend every day proving to you that I won't. I won't let my fear win this time, Evelyn. You are worth every fight, every risk. Please give me one last chance. Her heart ached with the weight of his words, torn between the lingering wounds of the past and the undeniable pull of the man standing before her. And in that moment, as his arms wrapped around her, holding her as though she was the only thing keeping him alive, she realized the truth. She still loved him. And maybe, just maybe, that love was worth one more fight.